Hello and welcome to the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. You know, if you visit the National Archives Museum here in Washington, D.C., on permanent display is the original joint resolution of Congress which proposed the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. A fundamental part of the foundation of our country, we know these rights as the freedom of speech, press, religion, and due process, to name just a few. Well, our guest today has taken that template from the Bill of Rights and applied it to citizenship in a new book called The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. I'm very pleased to welcome our good friend Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council is an organization that has always been, much like the White House Historical Association, nonpartisan and dedicated to helping people better understand the world in which we live. After 20 years of sharing and explaining the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries, Richard is stepping down from his role as president. But he's certainly not slowing down his mission to educate. In his latest book, The Bill of Obligations, Richard has given us a guide that he believes, if implemented by Americans, could go a long way toward fixing our deep political divides and even our fragile democracy. Well, Richard, let's dive into this wonderful book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. And as you know, we are the White House Historical Association, and it's our privilege and honor to maintain the history of the place and teach and tell those stories. And going back to 1800, when John Adams moved into the White House as our first president to live there, in your observation, how has the role of the White House evolved in terms of American diplomacy and foreign policy?
I would think the general trend line is it's become more important. Its critics would maybe have called it the imperial presidency. Others would say, I remember when I studied constitutional law and history, the sense was the Constitution was very brief when it came to for foreign affairs powers, in the plural, because it didn't speak of a singular one. But I think over time, particularly with the Cold War, the advent of nuclear weapons, the White House, the presidency more fundamentally enjoys the lion's share of the influence over American foreign policy. And again, it has less to do with the Constitution, I think, than simply the momentum of the office. Look at things like war powers. Essentially, presidents go to war pretty much when they choose to use military force. Formal congressional declarations of war are extraordinarily rare. The presidency can negotiate in many ways fairly unfettered. The willingness of the Congress to use the purse to cut off foreign policy initiatives, again, is pretty rare. And for better and for worse, the initiative of foreign policy, the initiative of diplomacy, pretty much sits with the president and the White House, and Congress and others are essentially reactive.
And how we are perceived by others around the world. Today we hear on the news, the White House today said this, and the White House did that, as if the White House itself were some entity. But it's the president, of course. How has the world seen us as a player in foreign policy from the earliest days until now? And are we waxing or waning in that regard?
I'm going to take a slight detour. My first job in the Pentagon, was 1979, and I was a pretty young guy. And I remember at one point telling my boss somewhat breathlessly, who had several stripes on his arm, was an admiral, and I said, well, the White House is calling and they asked for this. And he said, sit down. I said, yes, sir. He said, what's the White House? And I said, well, it's a building. And he said, well, can buildings pick up the telephone? No, not exactly. He said, okay, you got the point. People who work there call you. We may or may not take it seriously, but the White House can't pick up a telephone. So I never forgot that story. One of my first lessons of working at in the federal government. Look, I think we've had something of a golden age of American foreign policy. I'd say it began mid-World War II, when American entry into the war was decisive in the victory over Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan. Before that, if you look at the first long stretch of American foreign policy, we were irregular, intermittent participants in the world. We were much more focused on the home front, filling out the continent, developing our government, fighting a civil war, you name it. It really wasn't until World War II that we became reluctant but then permanent participants in the world. Coming out of the war, we had all the momentum in forging alliances, forging international institutions that have shaped the post-World War II era. So we have been first among unequals, I would say now, for 75 years. We obviously 30 years ago emerged ascendant with the end of the Cold War. My boss at the time, 41, President Bush, talked about a new world order. I think now, though, because you asked the question waxing or waning, I would say, though, we're somewhat waning. And it's in part because of the nature of the world, that there's more capacity, more power, and more hands than ever before. This is a world in which, even if we're the single most important power, we got a lot of company out there, whether it's military power, economic power, what have you. And then secondly, I think our own internal divisions, the polarization. We've introduced a large element of unpredictability and unreliability into American foreign policy. And because of that, there's a gap now between what you might describe as our objective power, which can be measured, but our ability to marshal it, which for political reasons I would say is somewhat diminished.
This book goes well beyond foreign policy. It really relates to all of us as Americans. And I loved reading it because it encounters something that I deal with in my role every day. It's as if there's a great American illiteracy when it comes to history and civics out there. And young people, we're now in our second or third generation of not only schools not teaching these things, but parents not being able to teach their children because they weren't taught. I can't imagine when we were growing up, you or I would have perceived a need to ever have a book like this. But what brought you to see the need for this and to write it?
Unfortunately, I can't disagree with you about where we are as a society now. This wasn't a book I ever set out to write years ago. 10 years ago, if we had had this conversation, trust me, we would not have been talking about this because I wouldn't have felt the need to it. I stumbled into this, and what would happen is I'd be speaking about what I normally speak about, foreign policy. And at the end of the talk, when the Q&A began, people would say, Richard, what keeps you up at night? Is it China? Is it Russia? Climate change? Terrorists? What have you? And increasingly, my answer was, look, I take all of those challenges seriously, obviously. But what really keeps me up at night is us. And the history of the post-World War II era is that so long as we were focused, so long as we were unified, so long as we had the resources, we could make an enormous difference for good in the world. We didn't always get it right, but more often than not, we did. And increasingly, I thought that had become questionable because of our domestic divisions. We no longer set an example that much of the rest of the world wanted to emulate. We had introduced a large degree of unreliability or unpredictability, so our friends weren't sure who we were anymore, whether they could count on us. Our foes weren't quite sure they had to worry about us. Our divisions made it more difficult for us to have the resources that we needed for national security. So increasingly, I actually think the biggest national security challenge the United States facing us now is from within. It's whether we can organize, come together, and devote the necessary focus, time, and resources on the world.
And how would today, in that context, how would today differ from the 1960s and from the American Civil War?
When I first started out on the book, several of my friends challenged me and said, you came of age during the 60s. That was at least as bad. You had the assassinations, you had the protests and so forth over Vietnam and the rest. And I said, well, hold it. We had assassinations, but the system was strong. We could deal with it. We had the protests, whether it was over and then ultimately the war ended. Civil rights years before, we introduced all sorts of reform. Essentially, the system proved strong enough both to stand but also to adapt. I said right now, these challenges are much more fundamental. If you look at January 6th, if you look at our ability to pass necessary legislation, this is much more of a systemic crisis. I'm not nearly so confident, I'm sorry to say, that we're going to come out of this where we could and where we should. Civil War was was definitely the greatest threat to the Union. It came apart, obviously, as everybody knows, for years, came together only after great effort and at great cost. Just to be clear, I don't think we are on the precipice of a second civil war, even though we're so divided, blue versus red. But look, I'll give you a different perspective. I spent 3 years as the U.S. envoy, working for George W. Bush, the U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland. I then went back a decade later as an international mediator, asked by the parties to help them sort out their difficulties. And that's what worries me. It's the image of a society. Northern Ireland, it's torn by different religious traditions. I worry here that we could have a society in some ways defined by sporadic violence, politically inspired assassinations of public officials or judges, protests that become violent from one side or another, interrupting the other. I no longer would say that can't happen here. So I'm not worried about a second civil war, but I am worried about a degree of frequent, widespread, politically inspired violence. And that would be qualitatively different. And in some ways, the second greatest threat to the fabric of this great democratic experiment, the first being the Civil War.
Well, I ask you how the White House or our country is perceived abroad. And I want to look at it domestically. How is the White House and the institutions of government in Washington, how are they perceived by our own populace? Do they have an educational awareness or context to even see these as long-lasting institutions, or do they only see them in the snapshot of a news report or a tweet?
I'd say a couple of things. One is there's an inconsistency. On one hand, people are asking tremendous things of government. We expect the fire department to come, the police department to come, the Social Security check to arrive, Medicare and Medicaid and all that. Yet contempt for government has never been greater. One of the phrases I truly dislike is the deep state. And I constantly say to people, hey, we're the deep state. Tens of millions of us work for government at the federal, state, or local level. We all the men and women in uniform. So when you criticize the government, when you criticize people who go to work for this country, you're criticizing your neighbors, your relatives, your friends. So and obviously there are imperfections there, well, let's improve it. We want to make government really attractive. We want the best and brightest to choose this either as careers or choose it for a stint. That's what we should want, because government's so central to our lives, whether it's to our foreign policy, obviously, or to our domestic lives. So we want to stop tearing down government. One of the things I advocate in this book is public service. And I think it's a way to overcome that divide between people and government. I'm not saying we should mandate it. I'm not talking about a draft, but we ought to incentivize it. Provide money for people to go do public service jobs, to rebuild our cities or help on environmental issues.
Was Teach for America a foray into that?
Absolutely. Things like Teach for America, all sorts of forms of public service. I think employers ought to make it a point of hiring people who have such experience. Universities could give preferential admissions to young people, say, who spend 1 or 2 years in a gap year. But there's another benefit here also. So many Americans now have separate lives. You tell me people's geography, how much education they have, their church, their gender, whatever, what have you, what cable station they watch, what radio station they listen to. I can tell you then a lot about them. And what worries me is increasingly they don't meet people who are different. And one of the things I really like about public service, it has the potential to once again create a society where people have some common experiences. When Tom Brokaw would write about the greatest generation, one of the things was the draft brought a lot of people into the military, and they would, the kid from Arkansas would meet somebody from Idaho and somebody from New York City who normally, and then would never meet. And then they'd have to depend on one another and trust one another and ultimately, hopefully live together. Well, we don't have nearly enough of those experiences right now. We're a much more divided, separate society. So yeah, public service, I think, has the ability to both narrow the gap or bridge the gap between government and society, but also within society has to, I think, the ability to bring Americans together who would otherwise remain divided and suspicious of one another.
At what point in our country did we go from, say, political opponents seeing each other as I'm right and you're wrong, to now it's I'm good and you're bad, or I'm righteous and you're evil?
It's a question I ask myself a lot. There's not a moment I can point to. It wasn't 1960 something or 70 something, but it's been gradual. It's a coarsening trend in American life. We've become much more focused on our rights, again, rather than our obligations to one another. Civility has broken down. I think social media has played into it. The anonymity of social media. You can be really violent in your language because you're hiding behind this veil of anonymity. People are spending a lot of time on screens rather than in talking to one another. One thing we've alluded to before, we no longer study this in schools, right? We have about 4,000 colleges and universities in America. You can graduate with just about all of them and never having studied about the basics of this country, its history, its institutions, its government. It's offered in many places, it's just not required. You can go to most middle schools and high schools and again, either not study it or what you study would be woefully inadequate. You know, the push for STEM and all those courses, as valuable they are, crowded out. I think it was civics was one of the unintentional casualties of the STEM movement. So I think there's any number of reasons about how American society has, in some ways, broken down along certain lines. And I think one other thing, if you look at the last 20 years, this has been a rough time for many people in this society. We've had the financial crises of 07, 08, the more recent one. We had the pandemic, the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq. We had January 6th. We had the leveling off of middle-class wages. The American dream, mobility have increasingly become a dream rather than a reality. So more and more Americans look at our democratic government and they say, what has it done for me? And a lot of them say, I know what it's done to me, but that's something different. So what we've lost over the decades is a certain appreciation of, almost a reverence for this inheritance we have. And again, that's one of the things that led me to write this. I want to remind people why democracy is so valuable, why it could be even more valuable, but that demands things from us as citizens. We've got to do our share. It won't just happen because it should happen. It will only happen because Americans become as sensitive to their obligations as they seem to be to their rights.
Well, I certainly understand and respect the importance of STEM and that element of education. But civics, history is just so on the margins if they're at all. And often when I talk to young people and students, I encourage them to study history, to know history. Maybe they're not interested fully in American history or European history, but they should at least know the history of their own field that they're going into. So now we have people going into fields in whether it's business or foreign policy or the law or medicine, and they have no idea of the evolution of the practice or the field ahead before them. They're just in the now. And I think that that's a part of the weakness of our culture, that we don't appreciate or understand those that went before us, whether it was the founding fathers or our own families.
Sure. I think that an appreciation of, a reverence for history is important. A lot of lessons to be gleaned from it. I used to teach a course at Harvard about applying the lessons of history, and I think there's also what we have to understand is none of us is born with it. I'm Jewish. One of the things I talk about in the book is the holiday of Passover. Why? Because Jews gather every year at the holiday of Passover, and they tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Why? Because it's central to Jewish identity. And what Jews have learned over the thousands of years of either being persecuted or spread around the world in a diaspora is that they often didn't have access to their holy places. The only way they could make sure identity and the religion survive was to teach it. And it's the obligation of the older generation to teach it to the younger generation. We should approach Americanness the same way.
That's exactly right.
We should basically not assume it's handed on, but it's your it's your responsibility, it's my responsibility to make sure our kids and the next generation, the next, that they understand this inheritance, this valuable inheritance they're getting, and why it's worth protecting.
Well, delving into the book a little bit more, I want to start with the last chapter, the where to go for more. As we are in the end of spring and the beginning of summer, the commencement season in America, I think this is a perfect blueprint for a commencement address, this last chapter, to outline the resources. It's a prescription for how to achieve this in your life and how to deploy this in your life. And I wish I know you'd like this too, every high school graduate and every college graduate in America to read this book, because it opens your eyes to things that you and I would have taken for granted, I think, when we were at that point in our lives, that they don't even think about now.
One of the great contradictions of this moment is that we're surrounded by information. And you would think, why is it even necessary to say where to go for more? There's so much out there. But the problem is there's so much out there. A lot of it turns out to be misinformation. A lot of it's not, shall we say, quality or trustworthy information. And because, again, people aren't taught this in schools, what I thought I'd say is, look, if this whetted your appetite, this book, here's all the things you can read. Here's the history. One of the things I did in writing this book, here we are at the White House Historical Association, I read the inaugural speeches of every president. I read the farewell addresses of the president. I had never done that. And it was a fantastic experience. Plus, at times, extraordinary literature, if you will, to read some Supreme Court decisions. If people haven't done it, to sit in on oral arguments at the Supreme Court, that's one of those great experiences that every American should see. Or sit in on the congressional hearing or the town hall.
Or exactly, or even in your own community, to go to the courthouse in your own community or your congressional member's town hall in that own community.
Serve on a jury. Everyone's, I know, tends to want to work around. It's always inconvenient. You've always got work to go to or what have you. When I served on a jury for 2 days once, what an amazing experience.
It is an amazing experience.
It makes actually democracy and civic life, it makes it real. It's no longer something you read about. It's also something you can and should experience.
Well, I want to just click through these 10 obligations and give me the nugget on each one and why you chose to put this in the book. Be informed.
It's the most basic. If you look at Jefferson and others, it's the foundation of living in a representative democracy. It's the only way, if we're informed, that we can keep people who have power, we can hold them to account. So if you're going to act in a democracy on behalf of the country's interests or your own, how else can you do it if you're not informed enough to know what it is you're doing?
And ways to be informed.
Talk about, multi-sourcing information, not just depending on one place. Go to places that have editors, that's authenticated. Remember that social media has the word social in front of it. Mm-hmm. Is probably not a place. It's not called serious media. It's not called factual media. So maybe avoid that when it comes to these things. And that's where also schools and others come in.
Get involved.
Yeah. Democracy is not a spectator sport. I want people to be informed, and then once they're informed citizens, I want them to be involved citizens. At a minimum, vote. We still have the situation where at the most recent elections, the midterms, as critical as they were, more than half of the eligible voters didn't vote. And then by not acting, you're essentially letting others decide your future and your country's future. So just out of self-interest, I want people to get involved.
Stay open to compromise. Why is compromise a bad word now?
When John F. Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage, a lot of the people he profiled were people who were willing to compromise, to take the heat. In a democracy, we don't get a lot done without it. We would not have had this democracy without compromise. It was central to the convention and the Constitution. It's central to getting things done. It's gotten harder because of social media and the way we fund our politics. The extremes have a loud voice, but we simply cannot get anything of value done without a willingness to give as well as take.
Remain civil.
Look, it's practical again. Your arguments tend not to get better if you shout or curse or speak over other people. But just practically, you and I may disagree on an issue today, but tomorrow we may want to agree on something, work together. But if I've been uncivil to you today, if I've wrecked our relationship, you are not going to be a partner. So people ought to remain civil, one, to be persuasive. It tends not to make you more persuasive if you're uncivil, but to maintain relationships so at least you keep open the possibility of cooperating where your interests actually do align.
You talk about, in the book, you share the wonderful story between two justices of the Supreme Court that are very different or were very different in ideology, but had a great relationship. Tell us that story.
Yeah, it's a story between a conservative jurist, Antonin Scalia, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was liberal or progressive, whatever word you want. They became the closest of friends, would go to opera and all have dinners together, but also they would push one another intellectually. And they each came away from it with greater insight, greater understanding. So even if they stayed where they were better than they were before the interaction. How good is that, to hone your arguments and yet maintain the relationship, the friendship, the civility? What a model that is for all of us.
I loved reading that something along the lines that she said, listening to him made her hone in her own arguments even more so to make her point.
That's a pretty good definition of friendship, actually.
Sure,
because actually it's someone who pushes you to be better than you are. Not bad.
Reject violence.
In a democracy, how can you have violence? No political pursuit is worth it. Again, if violence ever becomes commonplace here, that's the end of American democracy. You can't have democracy at the end of a bayonet. And this is something, by the way, where religious authorities have got to step up. They've got to essentially say, no matter how strongly you feel about abortion or any other issue, that's fine. But no issue justifies the use of violence as a means toward that end.
Value norms.
Norms are essential. Laws are necessary, but not enough. So much of political life and of public life happens short of the law, where you don't violate the law, but you're still doing things that maybe you ought not to. The most fundamental law, and you never find it in the Constitution, is when you lose an election, you concede. The peaceful transfer of power is the greatest demonstration of American democracy to the rest of the world. So norms are a way of making our system work. They kind of grease it in a very good way. Without it, we're much more likely to have friction, and ultimately friction leads to conflict.
Promote the common good.
Again, a scriptural idea. Being one's brother's or one's sister's keeper. We live in a society. We live in a community, so we can't just be about ourselves. And whether it comes into debates about the Second Amendment, it came into debates about wearing masks and getting vaccinated during COVID-19. But we have to think not just about our rights to do things, but we also have to think about the consequences of our exercising our rights in an absolute way for somebody else, or turn it around. If they exercise their rights in an absolute way, that might not be good for our situation. So to think collectively and not just individually is essential if a society is going to hang together.
Respect government service.
Government is us. We want government to be capable. We want it to be defined by quality. We want the best people to make it a career. We ought to criticize it when it deserves criticism. But for God's sake, why would we tear down something that is so central to our lives?
Support the teaching of civics. Well, we've discussed this as so fundamental and so gone. How do we recover it?
One of the reasons I wrote this book is I want to start a national conversation on this. I want Americans to talk about citizenship, to understand why democracy is valuable, what does it require of citizens. It's not just what citizens are owed, it's what they in turn owe to one another and to this country of ours. And I think where civics comes in is it's teaching the nature of democracy, the history of this one, how the government works, the relationship between the government and the governed in both directions. And the lesson of the last few decades is it doesn't happen by osmosis. Think about it. The only thing most Americans do is they go to school through the age of 16. So somewhere before then, as well as after then, we have got to get this into the curriculum. I want to make this not a choice for students. I want to make this something that's required in high schools and colleges.
Put country first.
Sorry I had to add that as the 10th. You would have thought that goes without saying that you put country before party or person. Again, coming back to JFK, that's what Profiles in Courage were about, putting the country before party or person. I just felt it was necessary to remind people that every day when you do things as a citizen, as a public official, look yourself in the mirror and say, am I putting country first?
Every week here in Washington, we see these flights come into Reagan Airport, these honor flights that bring in our World War II, Korea, and Vietnam veterans to go to the memorials here that they may not have ever seen before, to honor their service to our country. What do you imagine they think about their service and their sacrifice and where we are today, particularly the World War II veterans?
Well, I hope they're as proud of what they did now as they were then. On the other hand, I also know some of them, and I've talked to them. There's a bit of head shaking going on. It's not just the older generation looking at kids today. We've had that historically. It's more than that. I believe they are genuinely worried. You know what? They ought to be. If you're not worried now, you're not paying attention. And don't get me wrong, worry doesn't mean you throw your hands up or you give up. But worry means actually you put your shoulder to the wheel and you say, hey, we're going off the rails. Let me switch my metaphors here. American democracy is going off the rails to some extent. We have got to get it back on. And that's so we don't have the luxury of giving up. If anything, we need to try harder. And it means holding our elected representatives to account. At the end of the day, the greatest way to protect American democracy is we the people. And it means being informed, getting involved politically, rewarding good behavior, penalizing bad behavior. And that's something only citizens can do. I don't know about your experience. In my experience, politicians aren't always responsible, but they are always responsive. And what we need to do is send them the right signals that certain types of attitudes and behaviors will be rewarded politically, others will not, and that they'll get the message.
In your book, you reference that, whether it actually happened or not, that quote by Benjamin Franklin. And I hear that now more, a reference to our current situation. Share that quote with us and what you think about it.
Yeah, it was after the convention in Philadelphia. And he's leaving, and a woman purportedly comes up to Mr. Franklin and says, "What was decided?" He said, "Well, we've got a republic." And then he supposedly paused for a second and said, "If we can keep it." And I love that. And the reason I think you're hearing it more is people have come to recognize that, when Moses came down from the mountain with the tablets, it didn't say an American democracy is permanent. That's up to us.
Or that any democracy has been permanent.
Right, and democracies, interestingly right now, Ukraine is an example of a democracy that is being threatened by external aggression. But that's actually a minority. Most democracies, historically, have been threatened from within by erosion or corrosion, where essentially democracies forgot what made them tick, what made them work, and they lost sight of the values or behaviors or traditions, and they became vulnerable or susceptible to being hijacked traditionally by authoritarians or by violence. They got undone. So, whether Franklin said it or not, it's a great injunction. It's a great message that if it's on us to keep it, there's nothing inherent about democracy that's permanent. It actually takes work. It takes effort. That's a pretty good takeaway. So when you say you're hearing more people quote him, I actually take that as a good sign. It means they're worried, but they also mean that they're committed.
And it takes work not just by those who are elected to office, but by those who elect people to office every day.
100%. Democracy is not going to be saved by the thousands or even tens of thousands or millions of people who hold office, because at the end of the day, they've got to be voted into power and they've got to be held accountable. So democracy is something for business leaders to protect by what they do, religious leaders, educators, and what you said before, parents. And one of Ronald Reagan's great quotes is about how the dining room is central to, it's the most important room in the house and central to democracy. And it comes down to quote unquote ordinary citizens. They've got to get informed, they've got to vote, and every one of these obligations are things that citizens can and should carry out, whether it's civility or openness to compromise or not supporting or engaging in violence. These are things that all of us can do. These are things that all of us should do, and we've got to rethink citizenship. Not that we care any less about rights. Rights are central to a democracy and freedom, and what Lincoln called our unfinished work remains unfinished. But even if we were to finish our work, it still wouldn't make American democracy secure. Rights inevitably come into conflict with other rights. We've got to have a way for mediating in that, and that's where obligations come in. There's no way for democracy to succeed if it ignores the obligations of citizens to one another or to their government.
Well, I'd like to conclude our conversation where we started, trying to put this in the context of White House history. Now, let's set aside our 21st century presidents and reflect back on 19th and 20th century presidents. Give me a few examples of presidents and where they have excelled individually with some of these obligations as examples.
Washington, I thought, had a very good understanding in terms of instituting norms when he decided not to go for a third term. There's a sense of modesty, and he understood that the office should not take on any of the characteristics of permanence. Lincoln has to go down as our greatest president. If you reread Gettysburg, if you reread so much of what he said about saving the Union, it's hard not to be touched about. He understood what it would require for the fabric of this country to survive. I think FDR, what I loved about his presidency was his use of communication. The radio talks, fireside chats. I mean, the technology may have changed, but the idea of an educated citizenry, of an informed citizenry. Well, if you think about his fireside chats, what he wanted to do was inform the citizenry, educate them, and bring them along.
Directly, not go through the press really, but go directly into their living room.
And in more recent times, I thought Reagan and Kennedy. When I read their speeches. My own favorite, which is a transitional president, was President Bush the father. It's my 4 years in the White House. I admit I have a bias there. But both what he did and how he did it, the qualities of the person, there was very close similarities between his personal qualities and his political behavior, which I respected. No, presidents are important because they model the kinds of behaviors we want to see. We want to see presidents embrace the norms encourage these kinds of values, these obligations. But again, all they can do, as central as they are, they can encourage it. Can't mandate. You can't mandate good behavior. You can't mandate character. I mean, so much of this is about character, what the founders called virtue. Yes. So presidents can exhibit it. They can model it, but then it's on us to take it on board. And so they've got their bit to play, and it's large, more than any other citizen.
That's right.
But it's not a substitute for what citizens have to do for themselves.
And it tends to only last during the time that they're in that office, and then it's handed off to the next president who has the responsibility to keep that flame going from that bully pulpit.
Very true, which again is the sense of continuity, the idea that we're living in history. And so each presidency becomes its piece of the history. And again, it's that nothing's permanent. That there's something about democracy there's a little bit of tenuousness, almost fragility to it. That whatever momentum it has could very easily be interrupted. It's a thin fabric, and that to me again is the lesson of recent years. And what I'm hoping is it's something of a wake-up call, that we don't get sanguine. We don't have the luxury of being sanguine about American democracy, but rather we have the necessity of being concerned about it and doing something about it.
Well, thank you for writing this book. As I said, I wish I could put it in the hands of every high school and college graduate this season. It's a compelling encouragement to reflect on things that they don't reflect on, that they're charging through to life to think about the dollar and the keeping up with their colleagues and their peers. But this is so fundamental to the framework that we grew up with, to understanding our country and how to be a better citizen and how to leave it better than we found it. And I'm not so sure that that's the case for the world today.
We're going to find out, but hopefully we can help push it in the right direction.
Right. Well, thank you very much for this, and thank you for your time today. Great talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening and watching today. I've had the great privilege to bring you stories like the one here today since the program began in 2017. You can listen to the dozens of interviews I've done over the years on your favorite podcast provider, or you can watch them on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. All of us here at the White House Historical Association, thank you for your support. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you are helping to fund our education mission through teacher programming, publishing, and even this podcast. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.